We are very lucky to have two guests with us this evening. Bina Venkataraman is a leading writer on social progress, emerging technology, and environmental change. Previously a journalist for the New York Times and the Boston Globe, as well as senior advisor for climate change innovation under the Obama administration, Ms. Venkataraman currently teaches at MIT in the Science, Technology, and Society program. She is here with us tonight to discuss her newest book, The Optimist's Telescope, which draws on her life's work to prove that we don't have to be set in our ways and that there is, in fact, hope for our future and for the future of our planet. Called Eye-Opening and Hopeful by Arianna Huffington, and deeply informed, engaged in the New York Times Book Review, The Optimist's Telescope is an important read for everyone. Ms. Venkataraman will be in conversation tonight with Anne-Marie Slaughter, an international lawyer, foreign policy analyst, and political scientist. So without further ado, please help me welcome Bina Venkataraman and Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. What a wonderful crowd. So I have to actually start by saying, in addition to all those wonderful credentials, I'm CEO of New America, and Bina was a New America Fellow during part of the time she wrote this book, which means we think of it as a New America book. And I say that in part because I spent part of the last month reading another New America book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which is considerably less optimistic. Indeed, I've been, having a harder time getting out of bed every morning since reading it. And for those of you who haven't read it, it is essentially a distillation of all the science on climate change, and it lays out truly, truly frightening futures that are not very far in the future. So I have to start by asking you, at a moment where the science really is terrifying and it is being lived, I mean, we are seeing the wildfires in the Arctic, we are seeing Hurricane Dorian right now, how can you talk about optimism?
It's a great question, and thank you. I just need to say thanks to Politics and Prose. It's great to be here at such an important cultural institution and gathering place in DC and the country to launch this book. This is the first stop on the book tour. And I have to thank Anne-Marie and New America. Anne-Marie, you personally have been championing this project since it was the germ of an idea. And also, I'm just very proud to be a New America Fellow. And so I was with David on the day that he launched his book, David Wallace Wells, in the interlocutor seat. And I do think it's a valuable book. I think it's a valuable perspective to acknowledge that the crisis we're in with respect to climate change is very real. It's very serious. The signs of the warming planet, including extreme weather events like wildfires and more intense hurricanes, are certainly manifest. So I have no sort of reassurance that climate change is not as bad as we think, or not as urgent as we are hearing. The basis of my optimism is the fact that we have a choice. So I think there's a dangerous misconception that is prevailing and is in part encouraged by the picture of despair that I think has surrounded that book. I wouldn't necessarily hold the author directly responsible for it, which is that human nature is just doomed to short-sightedness, that capital markets are cursed to be myopic, that politics is necessarily locked in short-term cycles. And what my research shows through example and evidence is that, in fact, this is a choice we're making. So I consider myself to be an engaged optimist, which is to say that what I believe is that we have a number of choices we face about how to actually look ahead to future consequences, and that the examples in my book, which come from all over the world, sort of give us a context for understanding how we can make better decisions in our own lives, but also in businesses and society.
So you have you say in your book that our species are evolved to think ahead, that in fact it is our ability to imagine a future and prepare for it, to know that winter is coming and to prepare in various ways. You actually say it's the superpower of mental time travel, which is just a great frame. Now, as I'm reading that, I'm thinking about the many, many mornings I wake up wishing I had not eaten or drunk what I ate or drunk the night before, and wondering why it is that my facility for mental time travel, why I can't look ahead and say, I am going to feel really, really bad about doing this tomorrow morning, is not more acute. So we have this capacity, but we often don't use it. So why not, and what can we do about that?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, and we all make such mistakes or have such regrets. And sometimes the consequences, are a little bit of a hangover, and sometimes the consequences are much more severe. And no one's going to be perfect at this. And I think particularly on the personal behavior side of this equation, we have to forgive ourselves for some of the indulgences we make. But one of the main gaps that we have in our individual psychology when it comes to thinking about the future is that the future is not actually real to us, right? If you think about it, it's something we conjure in our imaginations. It's an idea. We don't sense it. We don't smell it. We don't touch it. We don't feel it. And so the very act of thinking about the future takes an imaginative leap. And we are better at this than any other species, documented. And that's why we have civilizations. That's why we put humans on the moon. That's why we can plan and build cathedrals across centuries. But it is impaired by a variety of factors. And obviously, we do have the parts of us that are impulsive, that have helped us react to predators since our hunter-gatherer days. And those, I think, are encouraged in large part by our culture and by the environments we're in. And one of the interesting, pieces of research that I got deep into was looking at sort of the context of what's known as the marshmallow test, which is, everyone has probably heard of it, but for anyone who maybe hasn't, the marshmallow test is this test that's given to toddlers where the toddlers are given one marshmallow, but they're told if they wait for an indeterminate amount of time that they can get a second marshmallow or pretzel or whatever their favorite treat is. It's
I think I failed it.
Well, that is a great data point, actually, because what happened with the original marshmallow test, which Walter Mischel, who was a Stanford professor, did in the 60s at Bing Nursery School at Stanford, is that he followed these kids who had passed the marshmallow test and those who had failed. And 20 years later, he found that there was a very high correlation between the kids who had passed by waiting for the second marshmallow and their outcomes, their achievement test scores, their completion rates in college. And so this led to, I think, a whole sort of set of conclusions. People who believed basically this is a predictor, right? If a kid can pass the test, then that's the kind of kid who has foresight, who has patience, who can delay gratification, who will be a far-sighted thinker and success. But the research that has emerged since that one study has really complicated that picture. And in fact, if you look at that research, what it shows is the conditions matter a lot. So whether the kid is in a peer group where he's told that other kids or she's told that other kids are waiting for the second marshmallow has a huge determining effect. Whether there's trust, whether there's scarcity. Cameroonian toddlers pass this test from subsistence farming communities at a much higher rate, at like 70%, whereas German and American toddlers pass it at 30%. So there are cultural factors involved. So all of this is to say, this is one example of how environment and culture and circumstances can actually change the way we make decisions about the future.
Okay, so I'm relieved, actually, on that particular front. Although my strategy was always to eat my Halloween candy and then to eat my brother's. So I was actually I had a future orientation and
you've done great.
And a present bias. But no, you say, I mean, and this follows from this answer, that actually future planning, making better decisions about the future is a design problem. So talk to us about what you mean by a design problem. And we're in an era where IDEO, human-centered design thinking, the D school at Stanford. There's a lot of buzz around design thinking, but how do you think of it?
I think the easiest way to talk about this is through one of the examples in the book. So I looked at antibiotic prescription. So here's a problem where antibiotics are being prescribed for the wrong illnesses. They're being prescribed for coughs and colds that would be better healed with time and rest, that are viruses and not bacterial infections, things like that. And now, we're looking at, in 2050, something like 10 million people contracting superbugs, which are antibiotic-resistant bugs because of our overuse of antibiotics. And so in the moment when doctors prescribe antibiotics, they're not thinking to themselves, I want to create a superbug. They're not like Bond villains somewhere in these doctors' offices. They're thinking that they're solving an immediate problem of the patient in front of them. So it's very much a problem of thinking short term about the patient in front of you, not taking the time maybe to figure out if the patient really needs this drug. And then it accumulates to a sort of general collective problem for society, a public health problem of superbugs. But if you look at the measures that have really helped to get doctors to prescribe antibiotics at lower and more accurate rates, some of them involve, for example, very simple measures, such as in an electronic health record system, when a doctor is about to prescribe an antibiotic, a pop-up message comes up and it asks the doctor to give a justification of why they're making this prescription. And they found that simple moment, looking across something like 10,000 prescription incidents, reduced the amount of inaccurate prescriptions significantly. The UK Health Service did an experiment where for 6 months they sent report cards. They sent these letters to doctors from high-profile figures in the UK, and they told the doctors who were prescribing antibiotics at the sort of highest rates, erroneous rates, that they were doing worse than their peers. And so using this sort of peer norm standard and saying you're lagging behind, you're contributing to the problem. And they saw in a 6-month period something like 70,000 fewer inaccurate, inappropriate prescriptions from just that action. So that is an example. These are sort of nudges, if you want to use the Thaler-Sunstein sort of framing of that. But they're examples of how you design an organization in order to encourage the kinds of behaviors that are more farsighted, that are more about dealing with long-term problems. And there are examples of how this can apply to climate change as well. In the Black Forest, there's an energy company, Energy Dines, that changed sort of the default option so that it would be cleaner power and more expensive power. And they found that people would actually choose that if it was the default option.
And we also know O-Power, created here in Northern Virginia, has lowered people's energy use just by telling them what their neighbors use, right? When you realize that you're the outlier in your neighborhood, you use energy more efficiently. So there are ways we can design to avoid sort of present bias. But this book is much more ambitious than that, right? You are not talking about how to get to prescribe fewer antibiotics or eat less, or you're really talking about having greater foresight. One of the most interesting things about the book is you talk about our capacity for foresight as if it were a muscle or any kind of skill that we could gain. So talk to us about how we actually increase our capacity for foresight in ways that would make a change on the big questions, on climate change, on the environment generally, on health questions, on how we think about inhabiting a common planet. Because in the end, if you look at most of the problems we're facing, it is everybody's making individual present biased decisions, including our politicians, and you're talking about being able to foresee the future and change it.
Yeah, so I think there are multiple levels on which to look at this problem, and I think it ranges from the personal to what businesses should and can be doing, and also to society. And I think at the personal level, a lot of this is about imagination and failures of imagination. So we are not able to inhabit these unprecedented futures very easily. And I think if you look at what's happening with these more intense hurricanes, like Hurricane Dorian, for example, the amount of damage that can happen now with higher sea levels and bigger storm surge and more intense hurricanes, for a lot of regions that are experiencing this, these are disasters at a level that they've never experienced before. And one of the areas of sort of capacity that I think we have is to aid that ability to imagine the future. And there are exercises like writing letters to your future grandchildren 50 years in the future, virtual reality experiments that have shown when people inhabit a virtual coral reef in the year 2100 and swim in that coral reef, that they sustain interest in activism against climate change and carbon dioxide pollution, which is acidifying the oceans, at a higher rate. So these are bridges between our current capacity to imagine those futures and sort of where we need to go. And I personally, the way I've started to think about this is a bit about sort of how we think of ourselves more as ancestors and less as sort of isolated in time. So this sort of framing of it, I think, is part of how we get beyond thinking on the time scale of just 2020 or 2024, but really on the timescale at which climate change is evolving. So when you think about your children's children or your niece's children or your nephew's children, that's a very different, it automatically kicks in thinking beyond 2050, which is when we see a lot of these climate impacts getting significantly worse and to the point of the uninhabitable Earth. Yeah, that's
so I was
the
going to ask you about an example of this where you write about fisheries. And this is a classic example of tragedy of the commons, right? Everybody knows that if you overfish, nobody will have any fish next year or 5 years or 10 years down the road, but everybody also wants to get their biggest catch today. So it's your perfect present bias versus future wisdom. And you have an example where fishermen have actually managed to increase foresight or increase future-oriented behavior. So describe how that works and how that might apply elsewhere.
Sure. So there's actually two examples in the book that relate to this sort of classic tragedy of the commons, which involves fishing, where people, the fish story you always hear, that there's been a race to fish and the fishery collapses and everyone's focused on the present day. And one of them is from the Gulf of Mexico, where the commercial red snapper fishery was on the brink of collapse in the early 2000s. And the system that was set up, which is a catch share system, essentially turned fishermen who were racing to fish in just a few concentrated days per year into long-term stakeholders in the fishery by giving them these shares that over time they could fish at times that were appropriate for them. So it led to a lot less pressure on the fishery, and the stocks have rebounded as a result of that. So that was like a very, I would say, goes in your category of design and thinking about how of the rewards and the system as it encourages people to be either short-sighted or far-sighted. But the other story I tell in the book is about a group of 9 cooperatives, fishing villages in Mexico, where this is on the Pacific coast of Mexico, and on the Atlantic coast, in the Gulf Coast, you hear sort of the opposite of this story. You hear about overfishing and depleted fisheries. But this group of 9 villages came together in the 80s and basically decided that they were going to treat their lobster fishery like a shared heirloom. That's my language, not theirs. But to think about how to manage that harvest for their children and grandchildren. And one of the things that they've done is figured out how to police that fishery independently of the government. They've set very clear limits, very clear sizes of the lobster they catch so that they're not taking the breeding population out of the fishery. And sort of the cultural continuity lends itself to doing that. But it is a way around what people, I think the classic economics formulation that we're just necessarily unable to deal with these problems of collective action just is proven false by these examples. And I think it's proven, let's say it's proven not that it's not the norm, but what this proves to me is that it's possible. It's within the realm of possible. And what I worry about in our time of despair about the climate or despair about the state of our politics is that we're neglecting actually that possibility, and that is actually abdicating our responsibility to take these examples and use them to invest in a better future.
So I love the concept of a shared heirloom, and I'll ask you just at the end to talk about your own heirloom. But this notion of we are collectively handing down something precious to our children and our children's children. It's not just about the future; it's about community in the present. And we're not going to address climate without thinking much more collectively. I mean, and so this notion of a shared heirloom, I think, captures that beautifully. that's a kind of an imaginative, conceptual tool for increasing foresight. But you also have a very practical set of tools. And you talk about George Washington Carver and the peanut. How many people know the story of George Washington Carver and the peanut? A few. Okay. So I'm feeling a little bit better because in your book, you sort of, well, of course, you remember George Washington Carver and the peanut. And I'm thinking, okay, I know who he is, but I don't remember the peanut. But so that's a much more instrumental kind of economist story about how you can also increase foresight.
Yeah, and I found a sort of present day version of Carver as well. But the idea, I'll explain Carver first. But so this idea that there were that Carver came up with these 300 uses for the peanut because at the time he was trying to popularize the peanut among sharecroppers in the South. The peanut wasn't seen as a lucrative crop, right? It was a sense of this actually planting the peanut was going to be long-term positive because it was replenishing the soils that had been over-harvested for cotton. And so in order to help those sharecroppers make these far-sighted with foresight decisions, I shouldn't say far-sighted because it sounds like it needs to be corrected with lenses, with foresight was to say, let's make this lucrative in the short run. Let's make it possible in the short run. And I think that that's particularly important when you have populations that are facing scarcity, and scarcity not just of resources, but also of time and bandwidth. So I think in the case of the doctors who are prescribing antibiotics, that's a situation of time pressure and bandwidth pressure that leads to a lot of sort of myopic decisions. And in this case, when you're thinking about farmers, sharecroppers or poor farmers now in the developing world, right? You're thinking about how do you bridge that gap, and I could go into more examples of that, but the sort of modern version of that is a Kansas farmer that is now trying to do the same thing to encourage farmers to grow perennial wheat, which has deeper roots that anchor the fertile topsoil of farms, so we can prevent the erosion and sort of the degradation of soils that's happening all over the world with annual crops that are grown fairly destructively and in a very short-term way.
Yeah, I love that example because it for those of us who are thinking about markets and harnessing markets, there could be a whole industry of like George Washington Carver and the peanut, taking things that are good to do and figuring out ways to make them pay now. Essentially, you're taking something that will pay in the future and increasing its not just its present value in the discounted present value sense, but what you can get for it right now, which I think is practical as well. So, what do you say though when people? Well, let me ask you another question. I have to ask, why do you call this a telescope? The Optimist telescope. It's a great title, but it's not immediately clear to me.
I think more of the ship captain's version of the telescope. So not looking up into space, but sort of looking out at sea, right? So how do we scan the horizon? And there's a sort of wonky answer to that too, which is that there was this British economist, Arthur Cecil Pigou, who talked about us having the defective telescopic faculty, that the problem is that we warp our perspective on the future, and that leads to a lot of decisions that aren't very smart, which I tend to agree with. But I think the telescope for me also implies that the optimism needs to be aided by tools. And so the book is really about sharing what those tools are. So in a way, the book is the telescope or the roadmap to picking up those tools that allow us to look ahead, not with despair, but with the ability to engage in this future that we're all shaping, whether we think we are or not.
But are you writing that book for each of us, or for our politicians, or certainly for our global leaders? Because one of the things you say, and I hear often, is you want to do the right thing. You want to take a short shower. You want to recycle, your trash. But you are one person, and all your neighbors are not doing it. And in game theory, you're the sucker, right? That's the sucker's payoff. So how do you create that sense of everybody doing it? Or are you really aiming this at politicians and saying, look, you can adopt a number of these policies that will make the future more imaginable, or the present pay off better, or however you want to think about it?
So it's kind of all of the above. So the book builds from the individual to businesses and organizations, and then to what society needs to do. So as you know, of course, Anne-Marie, but the institutional, I do call for institutional change, right? There's a need for campaign finance reform. There's a need for these policies. But I don't think that the personal is trivial. And I think there's a sense of a lack of agency in these problems that is becoming more and more pervasive. And I think when people look particularly at climate change or the state of our politics, what's happening with Brexit, what's happening in the US, they feel that they lack the agency. But I mean, voting is a very simple example of how the personal is political. And with only 58% of the electorate voting in 2016, right, people need to be able to imagine and inhabit the futures that they can't imagine, right? A lot of people didn't imagine that this president would get elected. And so I think that bridging that gap, allowing people to see the possibilities of how their vote and how their agency changes things, and also to see sort of the possibilities of collective action, because I think maybe if as one person you feel small, but the possibilities when you can work at the community level, like some of the stories I tell a story from South Carolina of a sort of community effort to change the political situation, which overcame very, very short-term political interests and sort of heavy sort of corporate influence that was trying to develop a very risky floodplain. And so I think while we are small, we can be very big as well. And in the collective sense, we are. And so what I'm trying to do is offer the tools that allow us to see ourselves as part of that bigger picture.
And so that's a community example. You also talk about an organizational example where you talk about an investment philosophy, which I thought was very interesting in terms of getting people to think about how you actually use the Optimist telescope to increase your financial returns, or as a fund, and perhaps as a person.
Yeah, and part of that, I think that orienting organizations, investors to the long term has both, right? It's both good for the investors and for anyone who might be pension holders or 401k holders whose money is being invested through investors, or if it's your personal investor. But also because the more that the investment community can move to this kind of thinking, the more they can hold corporations that they're invested in, companies they're invested in, accountable for long-term risks like climate change. So if you're an investor that's looking across a longer time horizon, the fact that wildfires and droughts and floods are going to get worse is going to be more in your eyesight if that's going to put your investments at risk. And so one of the things that I look very closely at an investment firm that does orient itself towards the long term, looking past the noise in the stock market, looking past quarterly profits, to understand how that happens. And I wanted to understand the machinery of that, both because I think it's important as a model for other investment firms, but also because some of the principles of that I think are applicable to all of our lives and even to how societies can think ahead. And part of that is how do you look beyond metrics of just the immediate success, which is, I think, becoming a more and more pervasive habit in our era of data-driven metrics, where we're constantly able to look at our incremental progress, whether it's our individual steps we take or the profits by the quarter or the GDP, and we're neglecting sort of the long-term systemic either opportunities or threats. So that's sort of why I looked at that example. And
I was just trying to imagine, as you were talking, what it would be like to have my Fitbit tell me not just my steps, but I mean, it could offer, a vision of a very svelte future me, or it could, or the flip side, it could tell me what's going to happen if I don't. But these ways of making the present future.
I was thinking about that with hurricane forecasts, because when you get the forecast, it's sort of like, okay, this is like the cone of uncertainty. It might be here, it might be there. This is how many inches of rain. This is how fast the wind's going to be. But what if you could really get forecasts that would help you imagine what that would be like? And I'm seeing some experiments actually in that space now too. But yeah.
It's interesting because as we've been hearing predictions for Dorian, I've been remembering just the pictures of North Carolina last year, where it rained, and bringing that home. So it's not just damaged. You're actually imagining those pictures. And in Europe, on cigarette packs, it's ugly, but they have pictures of all the horrible things that happen to your body when you smoke.
Yeah, and one of the things I did for the book is I did this experiment with, which is now, because there was a big kind of viral thing that happened since I wrote about this, but of aging a photograph of myself, because I had interviewed this researcher who had figured out that showing virtual reality avatars to young people, college students, of themselves aged would lead them to save more for their future, and or it was correlated. So I did this, and it was really fun because it was shocking. It was like looking at yourself in a future time traveling mirror. I did not spread it and propagate it to help any company with facial recognition, which I think is a sort of different problem. But I think this idea that there are tools, there are ways we can use our technology not just to reinforce being focused on instant gratification, but to actually help us imagine the future.
To cultivate the imagination, which is, as you say, is foresight. So I'm going to turn it over to all of you, but I'm going to just ask you, before I do, just to talk about the Dilruba, because to me, you're bringing home this story to a shared heirloom in your own life. It makes it wonderfully tangible and actually helped me imagine what you were talking about.
Sure. So the Dilruba is an instrument, and I inherited this instrument, a version of this instrument, which was handmade for my great-grandfather, who was a music and art critic in India in the early 20th century. And the instrument is beautiful and melancholy. It's played with a bow. It has something like 25 sympathetic strings. I play it very terribly. And I'm learning it very slowly, and it really, it became a metaphor, and I did write about it in the book because the instrument belonged to the only person in my family who I know who was a writer in sort of the history of my family or the president of my family, and it just became a connection to the past, this person I didn't know. My grandmother gave it to me, and he had sort of given it to her. This is her father, my maternal grandmother. And I guess what it has become a metaphor for are the irreplaceable and valuable objects, resources, and pieces of knowledge that we need to pass to the future, whether we're doing that in our families or whether we're doing that collectively in society. And I think practices that prevail today that are supposed to be about how we think about the future. Anne-Marie mentioned discounting or social discounting. But even if those terms mean nothing to you, I think they really need to be tempered by and enriched by an understanding of what it is that's truly valuable to us, that we want to pass on to the future. And for me, the instrument is sort of my manifestation of that in my own life.
And it's a wonderful invitation to think about each of our shared heirlooms and the things that we pass down. So open to questions. There's a microphone here, so please come introduce yourself and ask away.
Hi, I'm Robin Broadfield, a retired economist. It seems to me that some religious institutions are potentially a barrier to the sort of forward thinking that you're encouraging us to think about and promoting. I mean, for example, the Catholic Church is still encouraging policies that are leading towards catastrophic overpopulation in many countries of the world, and putting those countries on an environmental and socially unsustainable path. There's now a collusion between the Trump administration and a lot of evangelical Christians in the United States to take an anti-science approach, an anti-environmental approach towards US policy. Do you think that some of these religious institutions are indeed a significant barrier to a more progressive thinking on longer-term challenges we face?
Welcome to the book tour.
It's very, very interesting and provocative question. Indeed, yes. Now I feel like I'm in it. As a non-Catholic, I will comment and say that Pope Francis's encyclical is a sort of counterpoint to that on climate change. His encyclical, which was very powerful, set forth a set of principles making the Catholic case for action on climate change. So I will just say it's a more complicated picture, I think, than the sort of label of any one institution as inherently short-sighted or inherently supporting the cause of future generations. I do think I did look at religions and this idea of what I think is a near universal value of concern for future generations, which appears in the foundational doctrines of virtually every democracy. If you want to look at the godfather of conservatism, Edmund Burke, it's there. If you want to look at Thomas Jefferson, concern for future generations is there. And indeed, with all of the world's major religions and some of the minor religions, Shintoism, there are principles around caring for future generations, stewarding resources for future generations that are embedded into the ideology. That said, we all know that religion as it's practiced and as it's institutionalized can stray very far from those aspirations and values, and that's happening all over the world. What I think you're saying is that there's a crisis of leadership and in how these leaders are actually acting on those particular principles around the future. And I think that's accurate, and I think part of the question is how we hold them accountable and what the accountability mechanisms are for those of us who are concerned about that.
Great. Next question. Yeah, if you just want to go. Oh, there's a microphone there too.
Yeah,
Great. Go ahead.
So I personally agree with you that I don't believe that. I believe that people aren't necessarily inclined toward like messy behaviors or destruction. I think that we are capable of working together. I also don't believe, although I think I once did, in like human nature being inherently evil. I think that history shows that people have worked together on many occasions, that it's very possible for people to sort of join in the groups and accomplish things that way. One of the things that does worry me, though, if you look at today, is I feel like the problem we're dealing with right now, and this kind of ties into the question of the guy who spoke earlier, is that we do have a lot of people who are making very short-sighted decisions. And if you were to talk to them and say, the decision you're making is short-sighted, it hurts everyone. If you worked with us, we could change things. They might change your behavior. Maybe that's a solution for the future. But we do also know that there are people who do actually know exactly that what they are doing is hurting people and they don't care. For instance, we see in the Amazon right now, people chopping down the trees it's not they're chopping them down blindly, it's that they sort of see their short-term profit as more important than the survival of mankind. We know that multiple companies in the oil industry knew about climate change even when their people were pushing hard against it being a scientific fact and were in fact kind of moving their own boats and things around in response to that data. Those companies sort of use that information for their own profit when it would have been beneficial for them to tell everyone.
So question.
I guess my question is, what do we do if there are people out there who you can't educate because they simply are just in it for themselves to the end, and they know that they're shortening the lives of other people's children and of their own children, but they're just so set on their own benefit that they are just willing to condemn like thousands, millions of lives to death just for their own,
I think this is, again, about accountability. And this is the reason for the call for institutions to hold these actors accountable. So part of it is how do we decouple our elections from campaign finance, from the short-term interests of ExxonMobil's and those of the world, so that they can't have a stranglehold on the regulatory and legal mechanisms that are supposed to be protecting the public trust into the future. And there are examples of how that kind of legal accountability and regulatory authority can rein in such interests. And right now, we happen to be in a very dark period in some parts of the world around that dynamic. But I don't think all is lost. And I think the fact that we see these signs all around us is a sign that things are very awry, but it doesn't reflect what's possible. And I think if you look, one of the things I did look at is the history of social movements and understanding that social change is not always linear, that the basis of which, the response to the environment we're in now and the corruption we're in now from sort of various people in society, the way that a lot of people are animated around trying to revive our best institutions and accountability mechanisms for these kinds of abuses, that energy is surging, I think, in many places in the world, and particularly in this country. And that what we see around us today, just like when we see the stock market go up when Donald Trump says something, that's not necessarily really what is going on with the economy. Everything that is negative that we see today is not necessarily really what's about to happen.
And it's also being led by those who are the future, right? I mean, Greta Thunberg can see in her own lifetime what is coming, which helps as well. Go ahead.
Hi, Bina. Thank you so much for this book. My name's Jill Shepard Davenport, and I'm an engaged optimist here in DC. I love that term. I'd love to hear some about your experience in writing the book. How difficult or easy was it to find the examples that you wrote about? Were there so many that you had enough for a second book? No pressure.
You hope.
Or did you ever come up short? Were you looking for something and you couldn't find it? Were people eager to share? Were they reticent?
That's a great question. So this was a long process. The idea for this book really came to me like 7 years ago. I didn't start really researching it till about 5 or 6 years ago. So I started amassing examples a while ago, and that did help, because sometimes I felt like I was just looking for something positive in the world that was where do I fish for this fish? And I don't know where I go. And I think a lot of it happened through conversations with smart people that I know, and trying to say, is there anywhere that the tragedy of the commons has been overcome? Is there anywhere where a fishery has been brought back? Is there anywhere in the world where a politician overcame short-term interests and actually did what was right for the future? And that is hard to hunt for. It's hard to find and also to figure out, what do you attribute that to? How do you figure out what the factors were that were involved? And the reality is, like, the picture that comes across is not that there is a silver bullet, right? The book isn't like the Optimist telescope subtitle, "Just do this." It's a rich picture of many different tools that we can use in different contexts and how they work. And the great thing was that I did find a lot of people really eager to tell these stories. And I feel incredibly indebted to sort of my entire network of friends and family who helped me connect to some of these stories, and to all the strangers who spoke to me and took the time to tell me about the real good change that has happened in the world in many places.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your book. Question, are you familiar with Anand Giridharadas' book, Winners Take All?
Yes.
And if you could comment on how your thesis or your view of the current problems and the prescription for how to address them complements, is adverse to, or what's the thesis of that book and kind of a more polemical view about power disparities in this country?
The last time I was in this bookstore, I was listening to Anand Giridharadas talk about his book, so it's appropriate.
Yeah, so just in case anyone isn't initiated, I would say summarizing his thesis is essentially that there is a class of the super wealthy that through philanthropy and other means sort of masks, attempts to solve problems, but masks the fact that real change needs to happen sort of through public institutions. And I think my view is yes, and which is to say that I think there are real ways in which philanthropy and business need to and can change, and there are examples of how that can happen independently. There are real examples of leadership, even in the corporate sector, happening today. I sort of feel like it's dangerous to say that out loud in some circles, but that institutional change is absolutely necessary. That if government fails to provide basic public services and oversight, if the idea is that that we just let companies solve the problem, or we just let business leaders solve the problem of thinking ahead, I would say that that would not be what I would argue for. So I think they're complementary. I think we're sort of talking about different parts of the problem. I'm sort of interested in, how do we reclaim the future? How do we actually engage and not just despair over the state of our society, the state of our politics, the state of the planet? What's the roadmap for doing that for all of us? And how do we all take responsibility for that, and not just only point the finger at our politicians or the plutocrats? I think we all need to be engaged in the enterprise.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh. There is an entire industry that currently exists to train us to think in the short term, for likes and for hits, and how do we overcome that? And I was just standing there listening to you and thinking, hasn't it always been thus? Like bread and circus 2,000 years ago. The people seem to be constantly tempted into short-term thinking and short-term rewards. And while you said this isn't a how to overcome it book, how do we overcome that?
There is a little bit of that, how to overcome it, because I want people to be able to use the tools in the book. I mean, I think it'd be great if people can use the tools in the book to just make their lives better, and then also make the planet better in the process. But part of what I write about is how we can create sort of insulate ourselves at times from this culture of instant gratification. And a lot has to do with how we choose to measure things. How do we choose to measure ourselves? Is it by the number of likes or retweets that we get? Is it by sort of, the profit by the quarter? Or are we measuring the meaning of our lives in a way that's richer than that? And I talk about Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who tells the story of Solon, who was a magistrate in the 590s in Athens. And okay, so this is the part of the story that's apocryphal. All that was accurate. But Solon repeatedly, after he bans the practice of enslaving people for debt and gets suffrage for more of the common people in Athens, he goes to Turkey, and Herodotus is telling, and he goes to visit this king, and King Croesus takes him on a tour of all of his wealth, all of the riches of his palace. And after the tour, Croesus asks Solon, the magistrate, who is the happiest man on earth? Leading the witness. And Solon says, it is Tellus, who died heroically in battle and is survived by his grandchildren. And Croesus is sort of appalled by this answer, because he says, obviously I'm the richest guy around, like I must be the happiest. And then great misfortune falls him. He loses his riches and he loses his son. And so the story, I think, is about the snapshot of time in which we measure who we are, right? Do we measure ourselves by the moment, by what's happening in this immediate moment, or do we measure ourselves by what we're doing towards the longer endeavor of both what we're doing in this life and how we'll be remembered? And I think that there are mechanisms, there are techniques we can use in our own lives, but also in organizations and society, to insulate ourselves from those kinds of measures, from looking at the incremental too much. And they're everything from like hedge fund investors who don't look at their profit and loss sheet too much. They insulate themselves unless their earnings dip below a certain level. And we can do that also with our devices, I
was going to say, this is a social version of turning off your email notifications, right? I mean, so that you don't actually hear them, because you're going to respond, but it is a design question. You do remind us that we used to build cathedrals. Cathedrals were built over centuries, right? So individuals building them knew that they would not see them, but they did have this sense that they were building for the glory of God. So they had a vision, but also a sense of for their posterity. And you read the framers, it's all about, securing the blessings to our posterity.
Exactly. And in a more modern context, national parks, right? These are shared heirlooms where we actually have legal institutions that protect these. We have resources that protect, and each generation uses them. And I think that's what's different to me between an heirloom and a legacy, that an heirloom, a shared heirloom like that, actually gets used by each generation and imbued with new meaning. Its history carries forth to the future. And the whole idea of that kind of heirloom is enforced not just by the government having a program for it, but by all of us engaging with that and being engaged with it over time.
Another question there?
So we have time for 2 more questions. So if somebody else wants to hop up after.
Hi, Bina. I'm Peter, and I worked for a long time for NOAA, and I had the privilege of working with Bina at OSTP. And so, Bina, I just wanted
So if
to...
you just lean,
Sorry.
just pull the microphone up. There you go.
Yeah, so just wanted to ask you, Bina, about 2 things. The concept of prediction versus projection, and how we become a little bit, and sort of today is a great example with Dorian, we're quite dependent, or we think we're dependent on forecasting, and we're sort of attached to getting a certainty from an agency I no longer work for, but I used to call the crystal ball agency when I was trying to explain it to people. We get attached to someone, a tarot card reader, a psychic, someone telling us what the future will be. And how is that different from really having the foresight to really plan and imagine a future? If you could just articulate that.
Great. I love this question. Thanks, Peter. So I didn't plant that question, but this is, there's a distinction between prediction and foresight in my mind. And I think, so we make decisions with information, which is the prediction part, and with judgment. And I think we're investing a lot in prediction today. If you look at data science and the way that scientific predictions are being developed, the way that algorithms are telling us, who's going to buy what product next, how a flu outbreak is going to spread. And that investment just continues to grow and grow. But it's not the same as actually having the foresight to use those predictions. And that's where I think a lot of the gap comes in with our psychology, with imagination, with how our culture encourages us to focus on whether we respond to those predictions and how we respond to them. So what I really look at in the book are the ways that we can work on the other side of that equation, which is the judgment and the foresight to actually use those predictions to help ourselves make the future better.
One more question? So I will... I'll just conclude by, in the first place, just reading anything optimistic right now is balm for the soul. So I recommend the book just on those grounds. But I will also say, you're calling out to our collective imagination, and you give us many examples where the human capacity to see ahead has actually spawned positive action rather than the tragedy of the commons that we know so well. And as I read it, you're arguing that we need to cultivate this capacity for foresight, this ability to imagine and harness it in ways for good. But you're also reminding us, the book reminds us, of what we are collectively capable of. And that itself, I think, is an act of imagination, to remember and to imagine a world in which we pull together to be zero emissions, a world in which we actually thought that we could do this, and that we took joy in the doing of it, that it isn't simply about what you shouldn't be doing, but what we are collectively able to do. So for me, I thought the book was really a gift, but it's been changing the way I think about reading all the negative stuff we read.
Thanks so much for that. I think that comment really speaks to my personal reason for feeling that this is so important to share, which is that I think in times of despair, we need more than ever to be able to imagine a better future. And that is the basis of social change. When you have the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, you imagine, right? The New Deal gets imagined, the society gets imagined in a different way. And so what concerns me now more than any single fact of what's happening in the world is the threat of that despair overshadowing what I truly believe is our capacity to imagine a better future and to make it happen.
No better ending than that. Thank you. And thanks to Politics and Prose, and you will be